Hey there, this is Natalie, and in this video I want to talk about what happens in the world of Mushoku Tensei if Rudeus is never born. Now, it is a spoiler to explain why that is even a circumstance we know anything about from the light novels, and there will be other spoilers in this video, but they can be considered light ones if you've already heard spoilers along the lines of, say, what the deal with Orsted is, or who characters end up married to. I won't be spoiling any major events that haven't been shown in the anime yet, because, well, we're talking about stuff that won't happen in Rudeus's lifetime. But I do have to give a spoiler warning anyway, if you don't want to know anything that hasn't been in the anime yet. Before I get into the bones of what a Mushoku Tensei world without Rudeus in it would go like, though, I do have to quickly make an appeal that if you can afford it and want to help me out, please support the channel over on Ko-fi. There's a link in the description, and you get access to audiobook versions of my Mushoku Tensei and ReZero side story readings, just for visiting the page. I'm currently working really hard on building up my second channel, Natalie Narrates, but due to bad financial circumstances that I've talked about in previous videos, I'm not in a great situation while I'm doing that. So I really have to do a little bit of the sad e-begging. I'm extremely grateful for any help you guys give. But yeah, enough of that depressing stuff. Let's talk about Mushoku Tensei Law. Now, the light novel series follows the whole of Rudeus's life, from being reincarnated to his eventual death at an old age, and it's very clear that his existence in the world has an important influence. But we find this out from the accounts of Orsted, who's stuck in a 200-year time loop until he ultimately manages to defeat Hitogami. That's if he does, that will all be in the sequel. The reasons why Orsted is in this loop are explained in the prequel novel Old Dragon's Tale, which I have a series reading out on this channel, or the full 7.5-hour audiobook with no interruptions on my Ko-fi page. Plus, it's also explained in my character video about Orsted, so I won't go over it all here. But the important thing to know is that Orsted has repeated the last 200 years so many times that he's noticed who the important players are, and knows what happens to them in other loops. These would be characters who are said to have strong fate, which is basically a way of explaining why, no matter what else changes in that 200-year time period, they're always born. They always have a part to play, and they're basically worth Orsted's time to pay attention to. This can also be a convenient way to explain why characters we know and care about in Rudy's life still always exist in other loops Orsted has seen, even if it would be entirely possible that their parents, say, might never meet if circumstances were different in other loops. Now, once Rudeus starts siding with Orsted, a big part of his job is to make things go in certain ways that Orsted has seen to be beneficial in past loops. This can include anything from making sure Ariel is installed as queen, through to introducing couples who will have kids who Orsted is known to be useful people later on. Since not everyone in the story has this strong fate, they may not exist in this loop if the circumstances leading to their birth aren't helped along. Orsted has seen all kinds of situations, for instance with different people taking the throne of Azura, and he knows which outcomes are most helpful to his own campaigns. But certain people have existed in every loop and have always had pretty similar lives. From what he knows of this, we can see what a life without Rudeus would go like for some of the key characters, like Rudeus's parents, sisters, and wives. However, it's also worth noting that a timeline without Rudeus also doesn't feature the mass teleportation incident or Nanahoshi, as those things are all connected, and happen as a result of something from the previous loop to Rudeus's. It's very complicated and only explained at the very end of the light novel series, so I recommend watching my video about why the mass teleportation incident happened, or my character video about Nanahoshi for all of that lore, because it's really outside the scope of this one and much heavier spoilers than I'm going for here. So, in a world with no Rudy, no mass teleportation incident, and no Nanahoshi, let's take a look at what happens to various characters. The Greyrat family itself is a good place to start. We know from Rudy's first encounter with Orsted, including in the anime adaptation, that he is aware of Paul Greyrat, but that he has no son, only 2 daughters. What we learn about Paul's family is that the first child of Paul and Zenith is always stillborn. This was the body that the spirit of Rudeus's past life self found to inhabit when it passed through the rift into the world of Mushoku Tensei, which again is all explained by the mass teleportation incident stuff. And this allowed them to have a living son in only the loop we see, which is why Orsted was so confused by Rudy's existence. However, it seems Norn and Aisha are always born. This is interesting because for Aisha to have had a significant enough role for Orsted to know of her and that she's Paul's son, it means that in every other loop, Paul still cheats on Zenith when she's pregnant, conceiving Aisha, but that Zenith always accepts them and keeps them as part of the family. If Zenith didn't accept them, then there's a strong chance Lilia and Aisha would have died travelling back to Lilia's hometown, as we see discussed when Lilia's pregnancy is revealed in the anime. But even if they survived, Aisha would not have been known as Paul Greyrat's daughter, so it's clear that Zenith always does make this choice. And that's interesting because when Rudeus is involved, and it seems like he's persuaded Zenith to do this, Lilia thinks that she and Aisha owe their lives to him, and Aisha is raised to believe this too. In a world when no such persuasion took place, and yet Zenith still accepted Lilia as Paul's second wife, would this gratitude be instead directed towards Zenith? We don't really know, because Orsted doesn't say a huge amount about past loops, which does admittedly make them more intriguing, both to us as an audience and to Rudy. Still, we do know that even without the mass teleportation incident separating the family, and leading to Paul's eventual death while rescuing Zenith, Paul had no more children in other loops. This can be seen as because, in our loop with Rudeus, Zenith will only allow him to sleep with Lilia if she's pregnant herself, so if Zenith never gets pregnant again, neither would Lilia. Zenith could have some fertility issues or something like that, and that would mean that Paul's family stops after Aisha. It's also probably the case that the author didn't want to wrangle with there being potential siblings of Rudeus in other loops who don't exist in this story. It just adds a layer of complexity that wasn't really required. Aisha seems to be a formidable genius in other loops, just as she is in Rudy's, but we don't know too much about her life from Orsted. Norn, however, we do find out about. As you may or may not already know, in the Redundancy series, which is a set of side stories that take place between the climactic battle of Mushoku Tensei and Rudy's death, we see that Norn marries Rudeus. Orsted wants this to happen because in every other loop they met and had their daughter Lucilia, who became a very good friend to Orsted. This is covered in more detail in my character video for Norn, but essentially, Norn and Rudeus are fated to meet and fall in love, but this usually happens much later in Norn's life than meeting him does when Rudy exists and the mass teleportation incident happens. In other loops, Norn becomes an adventurer like her parents, but she's very mediocre at it, as is always the thing with Norn. Rudeus rescues her after the rest of her party is wiped out, and over time they fall in love, marry and have a child together, who is the last spurred warrior. In Rudy's lifetime, Rudeus and Norn are introduced far later, and the spurred other than Rudeus are not wiped out by a plague, so it's a different story for them to get together once Norn's older, and their daughter is actually raised with them in a whole spurred village. But what about Rudy's wives? Well, when Rudy doesn't exist and the mass teleportation incident doesn't happen, Roxy actually becomes Sylphy's magic tutor. Sylphy is a good student and becomes skilled, but not as special as she does when Rudy teaches her voiceless magic. Roxy, therefore, is not surpassed early on by her own very young student, which in Rudy's timeline caused Roxy to want to improve her own skills. Without the mass teleportation incident, Sylphy also doesn't get involved with Ariel's whole quest for the throne either. Most interestingly, however, neither Roxy or Sylphy found love, married or started families in Orsted's other loops. Rudy's appearance in the lives of these two women with very strong fate definitely was a big catalyst. But then of course there is best girl Eris. Eris, interestingly enough, does find love. She always marries Luke, who is Rudy's cousin. I mean, technically he's also Eris's second cousin, but Luke's from the same branch of the Greyrat family as Paul. But we mainly see him as Ariel's closest ally and one of Sylphy's besties in Rudeus's timeline. Now, later in Mushoku Tensei, when Luke first meets Eris, he does actually fall in love with her at first sight, but given she's all about Rudeus in this loop, she just knocks him out. Eris also never attains the same level of swordsmanship that she does in Rudeus's lifetime, and it seems from some of Orsted's comments about her, she remains as uneducated and boisterous as the Eris that Rudy first met, despite still being very talented. Other characters' fates in different loops vary. For instance, characters from royal families like Ariel and Pax may see different people take the throne, different rebellions happen, and so on, if different possibilities play out. But as far as those closest to Rudy go, this is what we know about what their lives would be like without him. Probably the most interesting thing to me is that Eris was the only one of his wives who marries someone else. This is because, conversely, in the reality seen by Rudeus's older self, which we learn about after Turning Point 4, and again, this is really complicated, and I already have a heavy spoiler video about it, so I won't go into it all here, but Eris is the only person who stands by Rudeus and tries to help him after he basically breaks bad. Eris is the only one who can have a happy life with someone else, but once she's met him, she's also the most devoted to Rudeus, to a fault, in circumstances where almost anyone else would turn away from him. I just find that an interesting thing about her character. But what do you guys think about a world without Rudeus? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.